And this training is meant as an overview for folks who may be new to the PARCC test coordinator role. I'm sure some of you may have attended other OSCE trainings that we've held over the past couple of weeks, but today's session is meant to be pretty interactive, where I'll be presenting some information, but also pausing occasionally to answer questions. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll also open up the lines, and you can feel free to share your questions via audio if you prefer that. Daniel has posted in the chat a meeting resources folder for this meeting. It has resources that are referenced in this training, and it also has a sign-in sheet. So if you can make sure that you complete that sign-in sheet so that we have a record of who has attended today, that would be great. And we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I know everyone is very, very busy and eager to get ready for PARCC testing, but I'm glad that you've found time to join us this afternoon. The resources for today's meeting, as I mentioned, are in the folder. This is the link that also has a link to the sign-in sheet. Just a note, for all of the slides in this presentation are also available in that link, and as you're thinking through school test coordinator training for your LEAs, you're welcome to use any of the slides from this presentation or adapt them for your training within your LEA. An overview of today's agenda, the meeting will kind of be in two parts. The first part is really an overview of PARCC, setting up, planning for test administration, and actually administering the tests and closing out. And then the second half, or toward the end, we'll talk about Pearson Access Next, which is the management assessment management system that school and LEA coordinators use to coordinate and create test sessions and things like that. So Daniel will be giving an overview of some of the more important features of Pearson Access Next to get you oriented to that platform. But the PARCC intro to being a PARCC LEA coordinator portion will follow this rough agenda, just introducing you to the assessment, some steps for planning and administering the tests, and making sure we're closing out, and then next steps, what comes after this meeting. Just some background on PARCC. PARCC stands for the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, and it's DC's annual assessment for ELA and mathematics, and it's based on Common Core state standards. PARCC is administered to students in grades 3 through 8 and in high school. Each year, OSCE releases a participation policy that outlines what the requirements are for students who need to be tested with PARCC. And this year's policy can be found at this link, which links to OSCE's website, and it has additional information about the participation requirements and some considerations for defining in-person versus remote testing students for PARCC. As I mentioned, PARCC will have both in-person and remote testing this year. This is something that's new. Remote testing is something that has been necessitated by the current operating status of really schools across the country. Just a note that students who take PARCC either in person or remote will see the same test content and the same test delivery platform. From the student perspective, remote versus in-person interaction with the test itself is the same. Those assessments are delivered through a platform called TestNav, and in years past, schools have been required to download a TestNav app onto tested devices, but this year there's an option to use TestNav through a web browser, and browser-based testing is what is recommended for students who are testing remotely who are not in school buildings. Remote testing supplements to the Test Coordinator Manual and Test Administrator Manual are also new resources for this year, and they provide some additional guidance for considerations for remote administration. And we actually held a webinar yesterday on a more in-depth webinar on PARCC remote administration, and the slides and recording for that webinar should be posted to OSSI's website probably by the end of this week. I mentioned Pearson Access Next earlier, and that is the system, the management system for PARCC for DC, and that's where test coordinators, test administrators will set up and monitor test sessions for students. And then what students actually see is TestNav 8, and that's the interface that students use to access the assessment. OSSI does require that each school submits a school test security plan prior to testing. They're due 15 business days prior to the first day of testing at the school. They provide OSSI with some important information about what testing is going to look like in your school, and those plans do need to be approved before schools are able to start testing. Those school test security plans are able to be updated if things change in terms of schedule, or if there are other test session changes after schools initially submit their plans. Those can be updated through the QuickBase app. This year, there are additional questions in the school test security plan that focus specifically on plans for remote administration. And we'll look a little bit later at what some of the information that we're asking for in the school test security plan. And there are exemplar school test security plans available on OSSI's website. Right now, I think the only exemplar up is for in-person testing, but we plan to have one up for remote testing soon. Now we're going to turn to some of the steps needed to plan test administration. They include things like attending training, which you're doing right now, assigning roles to staff, both at the LEA and school levels, registering students, setting up technology, creating schedules, training authorized personnel, so those school-based personnel, creating test sessions, and documenting those school test security plans that we just talked about. In terms of attending trainings, this schedule that you see here is posted on OSSI's website, and it just lists all of the trainings that are available through OSSI for this administration season. The required trainings are highlighted in pink. Some recommended trainings by role are checked off in blue, and then optional are checked in gray. And they are kind of required, recommended, optional by what your role may be in the assessment, either as an LEA or school coordinator administrator. The test security modules, I will note, are something that's new for this school year. Previously, OSSI held an in-person test security training. Clearly, that's not possible this year, so we instead developed test security modules that serve as the overall LEA test coordinator training. They're posted on OSSI's website, and there's a certificate of completion, or a quiz to take at the end to signify that you've completed the viewing of those modules. The next step after attending training is to assign staff roles to folks in your LEAs and schools. These roles and responsibilities are more fully defined in the Test Coordinator Manual and the Test Administrator Manual, but this gives you a good overview of the different players in the LEA in school that will be involved in assessment administration. There's, of course, the LEA PARCC coordinator. Each school is required to have a school PARCC coordinator. For some schools, or for some LEAs that are a single school, those two roles may be fulfilled by the same person. There's a special populations coordinator, technology coordinator, various test administrators for each of the sessions, proctors, and other authorized personnel who have received test security training from the LEA or school. Just a note for schools that may be in a completely remote posture and only administering PARCC remotely. All of these roles can be successfully performed remotely and don't require that someone is on site in a school building. Exceptions to that are if students who are testing require any paper materials or the human reader math accommodation, which requires a paper script. Those people would need to be on site in order to participate in those assessments. And in the case of math human reader, it's just the test administrator that would need to be on site. The student could still be taking the test remotely. One note about authorized personnel. The formal definition of any authorized personnel is someone who has received test security training from an LEA or school test coordinator. And for students who are testing remotely, parents and caregivers who may be in the testing environment with them or in the room with them are not considered authorized personnel and should not be playing an active role in testing. They may help students to log in to get connected with their test administrator, but after that, they should do their best to avoid being in the testing environment while a student is testing. The bullets that you see on this slide show a little bit more detail about each of those roles that appeared on the previous slide. And again, they're more fully defined in the testing manuals. For this year, there is a change in who may serve as a test administrator and a proctor. In past years, it was a requirement that the test administrator not be a teacher of record in the content area that they're acting as an administrator for, or that they would need a proctor present in the testing environment. Those two requirements do not apply for this year. We acknowledge that there may be predetermined groupings of students and staff who are in school buildings, and it may be difficult to rearrange just for testing. So for this year, a teacher of record may serve as the sole test administrator for their students in a particular content area. And a note about, as I mentioned, parents and caregivers are not authorized personnel. If a student is testing remotely in a virtual learning hub, the staff who are supervising them in that learning hub may or may not be considered authorized personnel, depending on whether they've received test security training from the school. The students in a virtual learning hub would be connected to their test administrator virtually and therefore be considered remote testers. And so it's up to the school or LEA whether they train the staff who are overseeing those hubs to actually be test administrators. But if they have not been trained, they would also not be considered authorized personnel for testing purposes. Folks who are serving in the roles that we have talked about, those staff roles, will be documented in your school test security plans, and also be assigned those roles within Pearson Access Next. And we'll talk a little bit later about what it looks like to assign those roles in Pearson Access Next, but that will give folks the permissions that they need to complete certain tasks related to setting up testing, executing test administration, and doing closeout activities. and directions for setting up these users will be in the Pearson Access Next portion of this training. The next step after assigning staff roles is to register students to take the test. Registration is in alignment with the student's grade level or the course that they are taking. ASSE pre-registers all students in grades 3 through 8, and we've completed that, and Pearson Access Next is now open for LEAs to verify that registration for students in grades 3 to 8, making sure that all the information in there is correct, and then also may make adjustments for students in grades 7 and 8 who may be taking advanced math courses. And then LEAs are responsible for registering all high school students for both math and ELA based on their current course enrollment. And the statewide assessment participation policy provides additional guidance for the required high school assessments and also for some considerations for students in those advanced math courses. As you're looking at registering students in Pearson Access Next, that information is uploaded through a document called the Student Registration and Personal Needs Profile, or SRP&P, which provides student demographic information, but then also includes information about accommodations and accessibility features that students may be entitled to. There are 2 new fields this year that I want to call your attention to. One is called Assessment Test Taken, and it signifies whether a student is taking the test in person or remotely. And then the mode of instruction is another new field that indicates a student's primary mode of instruction, whether they're in person, remote, or hybrid. And directions for completing the SRP&P are in Pearson Access Next in the SRP&P Field Definitions Guide, which there's a picture of that on the next slide. So as I mentioned, detailed descriptions of each of the fields in the SRP&P is in this guide, and it provides names for each field, the accepted values, and instructions for creating the file and importing it into PAN. I'm going to pause here. I see quite a few questions coming through, so I'll pause to take those questions and then we'll keep going with the training. Let's see. Does ASSE keep track of who attends a required training? So for the test security training, that's the only training for PARCC that's required by ASSE, and your attendance in, oh wait, sorry, Shannon already answered that. So the certification quiz at the end will document your attendance. The recorded meeting for access on January 28th, Jeremy, I'll follow up with you separately. I'm not sure, I have to check in with Mike. How do we get access to Pearson Access Next and a login? That is a good question that we'll talk about during the Pearson Access Next portion of the training, but in general, you can reach out to us at ASSE and we can figure out the best way to get you access and registered in PAN. And another question, is this being recorded? The answer is yes, this is being recorded and will be posted on ASSE's website shortly following the presentation. Did anyone else have questions that they wanted to ask at this point? Okay, then we will keep on trucking. The next step as part of registration is documenting accommodations and accessibility features that students are required or entitled to, and that's done through the personal needs profile section of the SRP&P. Accommodations require that a student have an IEP 504 plan or an EL plan on file. But accessibility features are things that can be assigned to any student based on established policies at the LEA or school level. And those do need to be, there are certain accessibility features that do need to be identified in advance through the SRP&P. In terms of determining who's eligible for both accommodations and those accessibility features identified in advance, school test coordinators and LEA coordinators will work with the special education coordinators at your schools to create those policies and making sure that accommodations and accessibility features are being assigned equitably and effectively. And just a note too on this slide that students should practice using those accommodations and accessibility features using a practice test before the actual assessment administration, just to make sure that they're comfortable with it and understand how things function. And OSSI has also developed testing accommodations guides that are available on the website that provide many more details on how to administer certain human delivered accommodations, specifically remotely. And they also provide more guidance in considerations for assigning accommodations and accessibility features. A note about the importance of the SRP&P and its accuracy. The information in the SRP&P is used by Pearson to provide certain testing materials to schools. So it's important that, to the best of your ability, schools are completing that accurately for each student and doing that by the deadline, which is February 26th. If after that deadline, student accommodations or needs change due to either changes in IEP or changes in how they're reporting to school, additional orders can be placed prior to the student testing. So through Pearson Access Next, the school test coordinator would ask for those additional materials, and then Pearson would ship those out to the school, which may take several days. So just make sure that if you are needing to place additional orders, that you're doing it with enough time to be able to accommodate your administration schedule. Accessibility features, on the other hand, do not have any external materials, and so those can be updated at any time before submitting the school test security plan. Materials are shipped to the school test coordinators at each school beginning in March. It'll be late March this year. That includes test manuals, any accommodated testing materials, and also shipping materials to be able to return anything that needs to be returned to Pearson. One requirement of those materials is that they be kept locked in a secure location prior to testing, and that when they do arrive, they should be checked to ensure that everything that the school ordered has been provided. We do acknowledge that some schools may be closed and not have anyone available to accept those shipments. And if that's the case, we're working on a mechanism for schools to indicate to Pearson that they want them to halt their shipments so that materials won't arrive at schools if there's no one there to accept them. And that should be done prior to the end of the registration window. And we'll be providing additional information on that process very soon. As I mentioned, part of the shipments that Pearson sends out are test coordinator and test administrator manuals. Paper copies of those arrive with the other paper-based assessment materials. Those coordinator and administrator manuals are also available online. They're currently on the DC Pearson support site, which is different than Pearson Access Next. And those updated manuals are available now, and also the accommodations and accessibility features manual is available at that same site. There are also remote testing supplements that accompany both the test coordinator and test administrator manuals. Those are only going to be available online via Pearson Access Next, which is it's the site that you do need to log into. We did share at the PARCC webinar yesterday draft copies of those remote testing supplements. There are, I think, a couple of very small updates that will be happening, and the official final versions should be posted to Pearson Access Next by the end of this week. But if you do want to take a look at that content, it's available in the meeting resources folder that we linked previously in a remote administration guidance folder. And you should be able to access the supplements there. The next step to get ready is to make sure you're setting up your technology for testing, and this may look different this year with a lot of schools engaging in remote testing. Those devices that students are using for testing may already be in their homes as opposed to in a central location in the school. But in terms of technology setup tasks and being able to conduct things like infrastructure trials, that's all managed through Pearson Access Next. As I mentioned before, TestNav 8 is what students use to interact with the test content. It is available as an app that you would need to download. So as you're preparing testing devices, the app would need to be downloaded for students who are testing in the school. But again, it's recommended that browser-based TestNav be used for students who are remote testing because it requires less setup. They just need a browser window to be open. And technology coordinators can support with setup and configuration to make sure that devices are ready to be used for testing. And there will be a technology coordinator training later this month that will go into some more specifics about recommendations for technology. As I mentioned, an infrastructure trial is something that schools can do to help ensure that they're ready for test administration. Devices will be able to run the assessments. We are updating the guidance on the infrastructure trial. There's an infrastructure trial guide that's available on the DC Pearson support site, and it's in the process of being updated to reflect considerations for remote testing, and that should be up in the next couple of days. The TestNav system requirements are also available through that page, and they indicate minimum hardware and software specifications for computers to be able to run TestNav and successfully engage in testing. Just a note about infrastructure trials. They are run through the Pearson Access Next training site, which is separate from the site that contains student registration information and information that goes to Pearson. The training site looks very similar to the real Pearson Access Next, but it is meant to be kind of a sandbox where folks can make sure that they are configuring things properly, and it's where practice tests can be run for students who are engaging in an infrastructure trial, for example. So a lot of the things on the training site look and feel very similar to the real site, but it's a way to do that without the stakes of accidentally changing student registration information. And just a note about students who may have accommodations that use assistive technology. Special education coordinators and technology coordinators should work pretty closely to make sure that whatever assistive technology students are using, that they are aware of how to use it during the assessment and that it functions properly during the assessment. And that can be done through practicing through the infrastructure trials and practice tests as well. I'm going to pause there again and just check the chat for questions. I'm not seeing any new questions. Did anyone have anything that they wanted to ask? Okay, we'll keep going. So the next step in getting ready is to create a testing schedule. The unit structure and unit testing time are shown here. So the number of units for each assessment and how much time for each unit is shown here. They do reflect a reduction in testing time from previous years. We have become more efficient in how we're measuring the standards. The content coverage is the same with fewer items, and in some cases fewer units that students will have to be taking. We're also not including field test items this year, so that has further shortened the needed time. And this reduction will hopefully reduce some of the scheduling conflicts and concerns that we've heard from LEAs in the past. Just a note, though, about unit testing time versus administration time. The unit testing time is how much time the student should be given to actually complete the assessment, but there are setup tasks and reading directions and closeout tasks that do add additional time to each of the units in terms of making sure that there's enough time for students to actually get through all of those processes. And suggested times for those kind of setup and closeout activities are listed in the, I believe it's the test coordinator manual, and it will give kind of a ballpark of how long approximately it may take to read the instructions to end the unit for students so that schools can build in that extra time when they're considering actually scheduling their test sessions. And in terms of test sessions, we do ask that schools provide information about their test sessions in the school test security plan. Those test sessions include, when and where those may take place, knowing that the location for some this year may be remote. They include the subject and grade and course and the Pearson Access Next session name, which does have or session code. It does have a very specific naming convention that we'll talk about later on, but just making sure that you are adhering to that naming convention when you are setting up your test sessions so that it will ease the approval process for your school test security plans. The next step in preparing for PARCC administration is, of course, training authorized personnel. And I think, as I mentioned before, OSSI, the only required OSSI training is the test security modules that we have posted to the website. And then it is the responsibility of LEAs to make sure that test security training and any other school-specific or school and LEA-specific policies are shared with the appropriate authorized personnel at the school level. So it's a train-the-trainer model. So OSSI provides the training for LEA coordinators who are then responsible for making sure that gets filtered down to the folks who need that training for school level administration. And depending on the size and structure of your LEA, it may be that the LEA coordinator provides the training for the school test coordinators who then train their school-based personnel, or if it's a smaller LEA, it may just be that the LEA coordinator is responsible for training everyone. But whatever model works best for your schools and your LEA is acceptable. And again, you're welcome to use any of the slides in this presentation, in the test security modules presentations, to help build your training for your schools. Part of that training is making sure that everyone understands what a secure testing environment looks like. There are requirements that are noted in the various modules about what should and should not be present in a test environment, and school test coordinators are responsible for ensuring that everyone involved in testing understands what those requirements are. There's also a document called the In-Person and Remote PARCC Test Security Guidelines, which outlines some additional requirements for test security procedures, and that document is posted on OSCE's website. And the document that's shown on this slide is the test security notification statement, and anyone involved in testing does need to receive a copy of this, and their attendance at training does need to be documented by the school or LEA. And again, caregivers and parents who may be at home with students are not considered authorized personnel, so they would not need to attend training or receive the test security statement. We do understand that remote statewide testing is new, it's challenging, it's a different experience for LEAs and schools, and many aspects of the remote testing environment may be outside of your control. But we just ask that you do your best to inform folks involved in testing or who may be in the vicinity of testing, inform them of best practices, of expectations for testing environments to the best of your ability, knowing that not everything is within your control. After making sure that everyone is trained and has an understanding of their role in test administration, test sessions can be created in Pearson Access Next, and they can be either created manually for individual students, or if you are setting up sessions for larger groups of students, that can be done through a file upload for the SRPMP, and we'll probably cover that a little bit more in the Pearson Access Next section of the training. Simply put, a test session is like just a group of students who are taking the same test at the same time. Just a note that in Pearson Access Next, students do need to be associated with a testing session in order to be able to start testing. From the testing session setup is how they get their student testing ticket, which is basically the login credentials that they use to actually sign in to the test and make sure that they are taking the form that has been assigned to them. As I mentioned before, there is a naming convention for test sessions for this year, and in particular, this year's naming convention differentiates between a remote administration session and a in-person session. The naming convention includes the subject and grade of the test, as well as the initials of the test administrator, and then an indicator of whether it's remote, in-person, or a makeup session for remote, or a makeup session in person. And then the test administrator naming convention is just last name dot first name. I see that there's a question, is there a maximum number of students to be tested in a remote testing session, or is that up to the school? It's largely up to the school. I think that you have the best sense of kind of your staffing capabilities and what can be handled by test administrators, just a volume of students that can be handled by test administrator. So it is up to the school's discretion how many students are placed into a remote session. As I mentioned before, part of preparing for test administration is creating a school test security plan. which gives OSSI information about what schools' plans are for testing. And OSSI reviews those and approves them to make sure that they're in line with the policies that have been set forth, and also may ask for revisions if parts of it are unclear or need updating. So the test security plans are submitted to LEA test coordinator by the school test coordinators, and then the LEAs send them to OSSI for approval. Also on this slide, we note the existence of a test security file, which is normally a physical file that is kept at the school and updated throughout the testing season, and documents things like your school test security plan, but also any irregularities or incidents that may come up during administration. Given that we know access to school buildings may be limited this year, it's okay for this year if school test coordinators keep these school test security files electronically in a folder, and then once they regain access to those school buildings, then we ask that they print those and keep those hard copies printed and saved for 4 years is the length of time that's required by OSSI. And sorry, I did not change the slide before that, but basically this slide is reiterating what I had just noted. But just a note that the school test security file may be maintained electronically this school year if building access is limited. This slide includes many of the fields that the sections that are included in a school test security plan, from when you're actually planning to administer the assessment, how your plans for managing secure materials, list of the test sessions and test administrators, and your testing schedule and who is acting as authorized personnel. As I mentioned before, there are some new questions in the school test security plan this year that are specific to remote administration, and we will be providing a exemplar test security plan with example answers and some reminders and tips soon on the OSSI website. The submission of those school test security plans comes through the QuickPlace application, and those plans do need to be approved by OSSI before students actually start testing. And we're asking that they are submitted 15 business days prior to the first day of testing. We understand things are strange and ever-changing this year, and are open to providing some flexibility in terms of reviewing school test security plans before they're actually submitted, and partnering with LEAs and schools one-on-one to make sure that your plans are kind of in alignment with what's expected before you actually submit. But we do know that there will likely need to be updates to school plans as more is known about what administration will actually look like and who will be in schools or remote at the time of testing. Before I move to the next section, let me take a look at the questions. Confirming that the student testing ticket info can be shared via chat on the day of testing. Yes, that's correct. The remote testing supplements do provide some considerations for how student test ticket may be shared with students who are testing remotely, and one of the suggestions would be to share it through either like a Zoom or Teams or Google Meet chat. However, students are connected to their test administrator. receiving a private message with that information is acceptable. Is there an example of the remote testing plan? There will be an exemplar posted to the OSCE website. I need to double check on the timing of that, but it should be fairly soon. Is the LEA test coordinator and the test coordinator the same person? So there are two roles that have test coordinator in them. The LEA test coordinator is the person at the LEA level who is responsible for testing throughout the LEA. There are also school test coordinators who are responsible for overseeing test administration at each school within the LEA. So if you are an LEA that is a single school LEA, it may be that there's just one person who is both the LEA and school test coordinator. For LEAs that have multiple schools, each school would have its own test coordinator, but then the LEA as a whole would have one coordinator overseeing everyone. As someone who supports OSCE students from non-public, how can you get access to PAN? Send a message to Daniel Alcazar-Roman and we can talk about getting you set up in PAN for folks who are supporting non-public students. Students who are in learning hubs or CARES classrooms considered remote or in-person. There's additional guidance about the definition of an in-person versus a remote tester in the statewide assessment participation policy. But in general, what designates a person as in-person versus remote has to do with how they are being conducted to their test administrator. If the test administrator is providing instructions, directions to the students through a virtual means, then that student would be considered a remote tester. If the test administrator is actually in the room with the students providing live direction, that student would generally be considered a in-person tester. LEA is a local education agency. Another way, in many states, they would call them districts, but that can get confusing in the District of Columbia, so we refer to them as LEAs. How do we find out who our LEA coordinator is? That's a great question, Dawn. If you can, oh, you're a DCPS, so your LEA test coordinator, we'll send you their information separately. But yeah, we'll send that separately. Our hubs are not run by our staff, they're contracted positions. Yeah, in that case, if virtual hubs are staffed by personnel who have not received test security training, those would likely be considered remote testers. Students who are participating in testing from those locations would be remote because their test administrator would be providing instructions to them through their computers. Can you confirm if we need 2 people administering remote tests or proctors are not needed? We understand staffing considerations can be tricky this year. Proctors are not needed. They are recommended for remote testing just because it can be easier for 2 adults to handle any questions that may come up or tech issues, but it's not a requirement that there be 2 people for administration this year. But if your staffing can support having that extra support for the test administrator, it could be something that LEAs may want to consider. Okay, let's move on to what happens with test administration. So the previous section talked a lot about registering students getting prepared to actually test, but this section deals with what's happening while testing is actually occurring. The first consideration is test environment. OSCE's goal is to have to the best of LEA's ability, consistent and standardized conditions for testing. We know that this year presents many challenges in that area, but just want to reiterate that providing education to school personnel involved in testing, to students about what is acceptable and unacceptable in a testing environment is something that we're asking that LEAs do, so that everyone has a common understanding of expectations. The next several slides have some graphics that show things to keep in mind when you're thinking about establishing a test environment. The test security guidelines and the manuals contain additional guidance on what's permissible and not permissible in terms of displays and actions within a testing environment. And again, we just want to make sure that LEAs are kind of setting a foundation for what's expected within both remote and in-person testing environments, knowing that you cannot control everything that happens. This is just an example of some of the wall displays that would be considered non-permissible in a testing environment. Things like material related to the content that's being assessed, or test taking strategies and things like that should not be part of the testing environment. There is one thing that is noted here, and that's the unit name, unit testing time, and information about the test itself. That is information that actually should be displayed prominently. For students who are testing remotely, it may be that the test administrator is sharing a screen with that information or providing reminders in the chat about remaining time and allowed time for each test session. So in a classroom type environment, wall displays could either be covered or removed from the walls. You could have dividers placed in student desks to minimize visibility of other screens and minimize distraction. As I mentioned before, this unit testing time and start and stop time information needs to be clearly displayed for students to be able to reference it during their testing. So it may be that the test administrator is providing verbal reminders or putting this on a screen in the external meeting application. Some students testing both in person and remote may require certain accommodation or accessibility feature materials, such as headphones, handheld calculator, a dictionary in some cases. And so it is up to schools to make sure that students do have any materials that they may need for testing. And test administrators who do have test sessions with those students who are eligible to receive those accommodations and accessibility features should be aware that those students are in their sessions and be trained in providing accommodations if that's their responsibility. So as I mentioned, like in this picture, a calculator, headphones, and dictionary are examples of materials that may be allowable if a student has an accessibility feature and accommodation. There are other materials that can be optionally used by students in the test environment. That includes the paper math reference sheet and something like a divider to minimize distraction. They're not required, but they are allowable. The math reference sheets are also embedded within the TestNav platform, so students really don't need a printed paper copy unless that's something that is beneficial to them and as an accessibility feature or just a consideration, but that reference sheet is accessible through the online platform. 2 sets of materials are required. That is blank scratch paper and a pencil, and a testing ticket, which provides the information for a student to log in. For remote testing, how these materials are provided might vary by LEA or by school, and procedures for getting these to students should be documented in the school test security plan. Some guidance, as I mentioned before, on sharing testing ticket information is in the remote testing supplements, and will also likely be mentioned in the exemplar school test security plan. Part of the school's responsibility is also ensuring that students receive the accessibility features and accommodations that they need, and are receiving those accurately. A note that most of the accommodations and accessibility features are embedded in the test platform and can be administered remotely. There are a couple of considerations in the testing accommodations guides for those accommodations that may need to be delivered by a person, like human reader, human signer, human scribe. And a note that any accommodations that require paper-based materials like large print and braille do need to be administered in person. Schools that are not open for in-person instruction in any capacity. So if schools are open in any capacity serving students either hybrid or in person, are required to provide an opportunity for students to take those assessments that require paper-based forms. It is possible that a student's family declines to make them available for in-person testing if they do need those paper-based accommodations, and that's something that is a policy decision that can be discussed with OSSI separately, but in general, the schools, if they are open and serving students in any capacity, do need to make that option available to have students take paper-based accommodations if they require it, but it is possible that the student's family decides not to send them. And in that case, the student would not test. One very important note about accessibility features and accommodations is to make sure that test administrators who are providing them have been trained to administer them, particularly in a remote setting. And then also checking that they are accurately assigned before students start testing is really important, so that it can avoid issues of misadministration and test invalidation. A way to check which form the student will receive is that there's an indicator in Pearson Access Next of the form that they have been assigned. So if you know the student should be receiving the text-to-speech accommodation, for example, that indicator will be next to their student identifier in Pearson Access Next, so you can double check that before starting the test. And if it's inaccurate, do not have the student log in, and test administrators should be in contact with their school test coordinator about next steps there. Let me pause for a second as I see a question about paper accommodations. So this was explained much better in yesterday's webinar, and I apologize for it being complicated. Essentially, if a school is open and serving students in any capacity, even if it's not full-time instruction, there's a legal requirement that students who need paper accommodations, things like large print and braille, need to be given the opportunity to test with those materials in the school. That said, we know that many families have opted to keep their students 100% virtual in distance learning, And in that case, we would not require that the family send the student into school to test, even if the school is open. And that decision does not impact the school's participation rate. And that student would just not test because that's a decision from the family and not something that was in the control of the school. Are there other questions before? Let's see. If my school's in session face-to-face, the procedures for testing are completely different, correct? Not exactly. I think remote and in-person share very many similarities. There are certain things that work in person that do not work for remote, which is why we provide additional guidance for remote. But in general, state assessments and the procedures that have been established over the years are for in-person administration. So the test coordinator and test administrator manuals provide very detailed step-by-step instructions that apply mainly to in-person instruction, and then the remote test supplements provide additional guidance and considerations for some of those procedures that may not work in a remote setting that need to be adjusted. Does TestNav record students' computer activity? No, it does not. Later, I don't know if it's in this presentation, it may be in the remote administration presentation. There are some considerations for what should be done to monitor test sessions that are being conducted remotely. Things like monitoring the Pearson Access Next dashboard and checking in with students via the chat feature in the external meeting application that they're using, whether it's Zoom or Teams or Google or something. If they are remote, are these resources provided on the platform? So things like a calculator for math and the math reference sheets are embedded in the TestNav platform when appropriate, so students can access those via the TestNav platform. Is there a letter that should be accompanied with parents' decision not to send their child in for testing? And how do we document that for OSSI? That's, I think, a question that also came up in yesterday's training that we need to circle back at OSSI and get a definitive answer on what requirements there may be for documentation. This training, the recording for this training will be available on OSSI's website, and the slides will also be available. Are there different language versions of the test? There are Spanish versions of the math test, and there are translations of the administration directions into several languages, but the entire test is, there's a Spanish version available for math, and otherwise it's available just in English. When will the resources be added to the website? As quickly as I can get a ticket into our web services folks. I'm anticipating by the end of this week, but it may be early next week that these will all be posted to the website. And that's OSSI's test coordinator training website. And can someone at OSSI drop that link in the chat? And I want to keep moving, so I want to make sure we do have time for the Pearson Access Next portion.
I'm sorry, which link do you want us to drop?
The link to OSSI's website.
Okay.
Thanks. In terms of administering the test to students, there are test scripts in the test administrator manuals. There may be some places in the script that need to be clarified for students who are testing remotely, because the scripts have been written for an in-person administration. And so in those cases where a clarification may be needed, we ask that schools draft language on how test administrators will guide students through things like logging into the test session remotely, and that they document that in their school test security plan. Just notes about monitoring testing. These are also, again, to the best of your ability, monitoring to make sure that students are following school policies and test security policies and procedures when they're testing in a remote environment. It's certainly easier to control this when they are testing in person, but for remote environment, it's again that we expect LEAs go over with students and with authorized personnel what the expectations are prior to testing, and do your best to enforce the testing. We are not holding LEAs in schools responsible for things that happen in a student's, for example, in a student's home in a remote testing environment. We know that you can't control everything, but we do ask that you do your best to make sure that everyone has a shared set of expectations prior to testing. A note here too on this slide about cell phone use. For remote administration, we are asking that if students run into issues, they first and foremost use whatever app they're connected with their test administrator to troubleshoot, so shooting them a message in Teams. If that's something that's not an option, a cell phone may be permitted to contact the test administrator or the technology coordinator to try to resolve those issues. But the first method of contact should be the meeting application whenever possible. Information about what constitutes a test irregularity or any kind of issue can be found in various places, among them the test security guidelines. There's some information also in the manuals about this, but any issues that LEAs in schools are aware of or irregularities need to be documented to OSSI using a test security incident form, which can be found at the link that's shown here. And again, we know that you can't be aware of everything that's happening in a remote testing environment, and just ask that you do report what you are able to report. This year, OSSI is not going to be conducting any in-person monitoring of schools. Traditionally, in past years, we would have folks come on site to observe test administration. Due to health and safety concerns, we're not doing that this year, but we will set up virtual monitoring sessions with LEA or school test coordinators throughout administration, just to discuss what's happening and any concerns that there are. When students have finished testing, specifically in remote administration, it'll be important for them to know what they should do next. In some cases, they may just log off the meeting and have independent time, but it's important that schools do develop a protocol for what happens when students finish early, how they contact their test administrator to let them know that they're done, and what they should be doing after they finish the test. So after testing is done, there are some steps that test administrators and coordinators do need to complete in order to close out test sessions and close out the administration for the year. In closing out test sessions, that happens in Pearson Access Next. So at the end of the test window, the test coordinator should make sure that all of the sessions are stopped within Pearson Access Next. There's a particular status, stopped status, that it should be applied to all of the test sessions. And while this slide does apply to the end of testing overall within a school, it's also important that test administrators lock units within Pearson Access Next after each test session so that students can't access the incorrect unit when they come back to test another unit. So after students finish Unit 1, the test administrator should make sure that they lock Unit 1 so that when students log in again for Unit 2, they don't accidentally go back into Unit 1. For returning and destroying secure materials, a lot of this applies mainly to paper-based materials, which schools may not have a lot of this year, especially if they're completely remote. But secure materials that do need to be destroyed are student testing tickets or login information, use scratch paper, and any math reference sheets that may have writing on them if you decided to provide printed reference sheets. If they are written on, they do need to be shredded as well. There's considerations in the remote testing supplements for how these things may be destroyed in a remote testing setting. And ultimately, it's up to schools to develop a protocol, but there are some suggestions in the remote testing supplements. There are other materials that are paper-based that are not considered secure that can just be recycled. Things like the manuals, blank reference sheets, and other paper testing tools that are not written on can just be recycled. And then if there's any paper material that does need to be returned to Pearson, it will have this black label on it that says secure material shipped to Pearson, and that does need to be returned at the end of the test window. And directions for returning those materials back to Pearson are outlined in the test coordinator manual. And just a note here that those deadlines for shipping things back are May 28th for paper-based materials, both scorable and non-scorable, and then any non-scorable materials from computer-based testing, the deadline is June 4th. And then after schools have closed out testing and returned all of their necessary materials, they're required to have school test coordinators and LEA test coordinators sign test security affidavits and submit those to OSSI no more than 10 business days after they complete testing. And then again, for test security files, those can be maintained electronically if folks are not able to access your buildings. But once you are back in the building, we ask that you print them and maintain them at the school for 4 years. Any test security investigations generally happen in the fall and winter after test administration, and that's why we ask that you document things in your school test security file in case OSSI would like to review any of those materials in conjunction with investigations. But I do again want to remind you that schools and LEAs aren't being held accountable for actions that happen in a remote testing environment that are outside of your control. In terms of next steps, again, the training schedule is available here and on OSSI's website. There are some trainings that are spread throughout the spring to be kind of somewhat timely to the tests that you'll be completing throughout setup and administration. This slide is actually, I think, a repeat from the last training, but there are some upcoming training events that you may be interested in participating in. We do have office hours coming up for SRP&P and for creating test sessions. And those aren't formal presentations, they're just times where OSCE staff will be available to answer any questions you might have. We'll just be in a Teams room and you can feel free to pop in and ask any questions. And then there are several webinars that are planned for additional information. And the remote administration guidance webinar did happen yesterday, but the slides and recording will be up on the website, the OSCE website, by the end of this week. And this slide details just a number of resources related to PARCC. The testing portal, the management portal for LEAs in schools, Pearson Access Next. There's also manuals and training modules and other resources that are available to help understand the assessment design and providing released items and some educator resources that may help educators be better prepared for testing. The Pearson support number here has specific hours of operation that I don't recall off the top of my head, but there is a call center available to help with troubleshooting issues, and there's also the OSCE support tool where LEAs can put in tickets for specific support. And just a note of folks at OSCE, we are always available for reaching out for technical assistance and support. We're here to help you and guide you through test administration. So please always feel free to reach out to us and set up any time to chat if there's something that is specific questions or concerns that you have. At this point, I'm going to pause and go back through questions. Test coordinators will have to give TA trainings on test security and administration, correct? Are these two separate sessions? Will training material be given? So for, oh, thank you, Shannon, for answering that.
Yep.
And for DCPS too, we can connect you with the LEA test coordinator there who can probably provide more specific information to DCPS. And I apologize that the Eventbrite had the incorrect start time. This session has been recorded, so what was covered in the first half hour you can go back and look at, but again, also feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have. All right, I think at this point then we will transition to the Pearson Access Next 101 portion of the training that gives a little bit more specific insights into that management platform and set up tasks for folks. So Daniel, I will turn it over to you and I'll keep advancing the slides.